Let's talk about one of the most profound changes in digital photography post-processing that happens in the past decade, and this is something that will affect us going forward in the next decade as well. This is ArtIsRight. Before we start, subscribe if you're new and hit on the bell icon so you'll be notified every time I upload cool new videos like this. Adobe recently held their annual creative conference, Adobe MAX, and I was there. During the keynote, the main theme for a majority of the Creative Suite app update this year has been collaboration. Working with a group of people that are in different areas and being able to creatively collaborate on a project. I think that's really awesome. However, one of the features that I find the most interesting and one of the most profound change in post-production digital workflow for the past decade, and something that I feel will deeply impact us and affect us in the next decade going forward, hasn't been mentioned, so it slipped by under the radar. And that is Camera Raw 15 and Photoshop 24 HDR Preview. Now, this may not seem like much, so let's quickly rewind and give you some context of what I'm talking about. So many of our Pro displays on the market now has support for HDR, high dynamic range. But most of the time, if we say HDR, just going out there in the world and just saying the term HDR, what would most people think of? If you're not a photographer, you wouldn't think this is a photography thing. You would go first to video. Being able to view streaming content, movies, YouTube, TV shows in HDR on the appropriate display, especially one with mini LED, I mean, you can get really amazing high, like super white brights and really dark blacks, or on organic LED display for that matter. But rarely will we think about HDR as a photography thing. Now, if you're a photographer talking to each other, you probably think HDR, and yes, we have been doing HDR for quite some time now. What do? We take our camera out, we set it up, we shoot the same picture on a tripod at different exposure, and then afterwards, in post-production, we merge those pictures together using Lightroom, Lightroom Classic, Photoshop, or any other program that you may use. And now what we have in the end there is a high dynamic range image. But what really defines that as a high dynamic range? Because viewing those pictures that could be a 16 or 32-bit RAW on our displays that we currently have right now, up to this point in time, even one that support HDR, has always been an experience of tonal mapping. Meaning that, yeah, we can capture all those colors and we can see all those amazing colors, but our display can't show it because the app that we use right now can't preview it appropriately. Now, there's a big discussion that I will have in a separate video about the different display tech and the reason why Adobe is limiting the support of this whole thing right now. And I probably mentioned this a few times already. This is a technology preview. What Adobe is really showing us is literally the blueprint, and the ink is not even dry on that blueprint yet. It's not done. The rebar, the foundation have not been poured. And this is why this is one of the most exciting times, because let me simply put it this way. Once you're able to see your picture in true HDR and see it pop, and I'll show you how to get your picture to pop in HDR in just a moment, there's no going back. It's like eating something delicious and you're always constantly going to crave that. You always want your picture to look that way. Now, I'm going to try to answer many questions along the way as well, but one thing to first note about this HDR technology preview is that there's only 3 displays out there that is supported at the moment and is only on Apple. So Apple Pro Display XDR, Apple Liquid Retina XDR display inside the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pro. All these 3 displays have one thing in common. They're mini LED, they have a sustained brightness of 1000 nits and a peak brightness of 1600 nits. So this being the key driver between the reason why Adobe chooses to support Apple Display first, because of their integration with the backlight technology, the display firmware into the operating system, it makes it much easier to control and deal with all of these. Even as I'm saying this right now, I'm fairly certain that the genius team at Adobe, they're really working on bringing this support to more apps in the future, which as of now is only supported in Camera Raw 15 and very limitedly in Photoshop. So Lightroom, Lightroom Classic, well, you can't really do this at the moment. But they're going to bring this support across all the other apps in the future, and they're also going to support other display in the future as well. I am fairly certain of that. So, well, now that we have that background out of the way, let's talk about HDR on this a little bit. So I am doing this demo on my 16-inch MacBook Pro. This is the one with the M1 Max chip on the inside, but as long as you have the 14 or 16-inch or the Pro Display XDR, you can definitely preview this technology. Now, before you can really go in and do the HDR preview, you have to enable these functions first in the preferences for Photoshop and Camera Raw. I'll leave a separate video that I made as a guide to that in the description below so you can see how to enable those. And just to clarify, the way how I'm capturing this right now is that the screen capture for high dynamic range will just show white without detail. So what I'm doing at the moment is I have a secondary camera that is actually filming this laptop display in high dynamic range, and then those high dynamic range are then mapped down into a standard dynamic range for me to compress and upload this to YouTube. For me to show you what I'm talking about, let's first start out in Lightroom. And I'm simply going to use two pictures to show you what I'm referring to. So this is an HDR photo, and this is a DNG that has been merged together using Lightroom Classic. So I've bracketed this picture at different exposure, brought them together, and now I have this image. This is a 32-bit RAW that literally has been compressed down so that it previews properly on these displays that I have right now. It looks pretty good. I mean, the nice part about doing HDR this way is the fact that I won't have any blown out highlights provided that I capture everything properly and I can have details in the black still, which is awesome. But this is really leaving something for me to really desire. Does it look good? Yes. Does it really pop all the way? Not quite. The other picture I'm going to use, this is the Aurora Borealis, and this is pretty much just a picture that was captured in a single shot. This is not an HDR, it's not a bracket shot or anything like that at all. But I will show you that both pictures that were captured with an HDR as an intention and also a normal picture that you may have that is a RAW file can literally be made into an HDR, and I'm fairly certain that JPEG files can be done this way as well to a certain extent, with some limitation if you really start to pushing the files really hard. So what I'm going to do is launch these two files up in Camera Raw 15, and I already have HDR enable on this. I'll leave a link and a guide on how to enable HDR technology previews in the description below, so you can definitely check that out. So right now I have this launch, and what we're going to do first is let's sort by the capture date. So I am now showing you this picture of the beach first, and this is the true HDR photo. Now you may say this looks exactly like Lightroom Classic does, and that's true because I have saved the metadata setting from Lightroom Classic to this file pretty much just as is. So this is showing me what my picture is looking like right now. So what I can simply do now that I have HDR enabled is that you can really see up here in Edit, there is an HDR button. So if you click on that HDR button, what you have now is a picture that, well, if you just enable this, your picture changed a little bit. For example, I'm able to see some of the highlights pop a little bit more in the cloud and in the mountain and the snow in the mountain, but that's about it. Not much has really changed. So you may wonder, well, what's this hype all about? Like, does it really just look that much better? I mean, that doesn't seem like it's worth it. Let's take a look at the other photo. If I have HDR enabled, I mean, the green becomes slightly brighter. There's not much to really be seen beyond that. Well, let me give you a quick hint on how to edit these and really maximize this out. So I'm going to enable HDR right now. And the way how this works when you enable HDR, you're going to notice a few things is that your histogram now has two separate portions. So now it has the SDR portion and the HDR portion. One thing that I have been getting questions about this on is how would this HDR preview affect the way how you would print? And the answer to that is no, because I'm going to show you later on there is a way to tonal map all this back to show you how your image would print like, especially if you're doing the HDR edit. But for now, let's really focus on these two separate histograms. Now what I'm going to do next doesn't really involve basic editing too much because I've done everything that I can so far, but what I'm going to really target right now is the curve. And the way how I'm going to do this, I'm just going to use what they call the point curve, which is pretty much allowing me to just put the point wherever I want and drag it freely like I would in Photoshop. And what I'm going to do now is this point has been set at the maximum 255 for SDR. Well, I'm simply going to bring this up all the way to the top, like what you're seeing right now. And what I'm going to do is bring this out so that I am constantly maximizing the tone. Now, what I'm also doing at this point in time is that I'm paying attention up here on the top right corner of the histogram as well. You see that is in black right now. It's telling me that I'm not clipping any highlights at the moment. So what I want to do is really maximize tone by doing this. And now that I'm clipping some of the white a little bit, I'll stop there and I'll maximize some of the blacks a little bit. And now you can see my ACR picture. This is the one that's capturing ACR really pops. So I'll show you the before. And the before obviously looks super dull now that I have make this drastic edit and turn it off. But this is what it pretty much looks like at this point in time. Now, in the basic panel, what I also have is the ability to go in and do some high dynamic range adjustment. For example, it has visualized HDR range. So you can do that and you can pretty much highlight that there and it will show you these are the range are in HDR, meaning that these are not really printable, or if you have this in viewing on a normal display, it's not really going to show. But what I can do next is say preview for SDR display. And this is pretty much very similar to the way how my picture looks in Lightroom Classic, although everything is at 0 right now, so I'm not obviously getting so much of like the XDR, look of it from Lightroom Classic, the way how I have edited this picture at the moment. But you get the idea that if you ever need to generate a preview going forward in the future for displays that does not support HDR, well, you will be doing the adjustment there. If you ever sent this file to print and you're sending it in a hybrid format, both for HDR viewing and for printing, you'll be using those sliders to make the adjustment to your picture how you want it to print. So the preview in standard dynamic range really helps in this regard. But taking that out, seeing your pictures the way how it is right now, this really pops in a way how I can't tell you. The mountain, the sky, the beach, the foreground just separates out from each other. And this is absolutely amazing. Now, a few things to note as well is that if you're running this on battery power on the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pro, using HDR this way really just drains the battery quite significantly. And the other thing that I have set on my display as well is that whether you use preset or reference mode, you don't have to be in Apple Display XDR, but you have to enable HDR Preview on the other reference mode that you set. And I'll make another separate video talking about that as well, but let's not worry about that too much right now. All right, so now that I've seen that picture looks really cool, let's go into this picture. So this is a picture of the aurora. I'm gonna enable HDR now, and it doesn't really pop out that much more. Let's see if we can make something out of this. So what I'm simply gonna do is go back into curve again, and using the same method that I've used before, I'm gonna delete that extra point. I'll bring this all the way to the end, and what I'm simply going to do is just maximize the tone until it starts clipping. If you're with me in person right now, I can't tell you how this picture really pops out, how all the bright little dots that are stars in the sky just really jumps out right at you in a way how it was not able to do before. Now, this was not a picture that was captured in HDR or for HDR merging by any means. And I'm still able to do this. I'm still able to separate the tones and get everything to pop. In fact, I can make this pop even a little bit more by putting an S-curve on there and just making this really jump out of the laptop screen. This to me, it's just absolutely amazing. So obviously, what I'm showing you right now, the key to getting your HDR picture or any type of HDR edit or HDR preview to pop has a lot to do with this tone curve. And a lot of times what you're seeing right now is that I'm using a point curve to do that adjustment, not the parametric curve, because you can see this becomes limiting right away. What I'm using is this, and this gives me that much more control. Obviously, if I want to do this for print, what I would say is just preview for SDR display. And I'll just dial these things up and down depending on where I think this picture should be. And we'll bring some of the tones back and everything. So this is one way of preserving it, which I think is just really neat. Obviously, with my type of drastic edit, the way how I see this right now is that this SDR tonal mapping can improve in the future, number one. And if it doesn't, well, I'll simply export my files and edit in two separate ways. One for HDR content consumption, if I upload this to the web, should a display be capable of showing HDR? I can see that. And another one, if I'm ever sending to print, I would just do a print version of it using virtual copy or something like that. And assuming by that time Lightroom Classic would support this technology. So based on this so far, it looks really amazing. Now, some of you may ask, what happens if I have a display that's capable of HDR and have HDR support such as BenQ, SW, or PD line displays? These are BenQ Pro displays. And the answer to that right now is that on this technology preview, it is not supported just yet because those display and many other brands out there as well uses HDR tonal mapping technology. That is HDR10, HDR10 Plus, HLG, or Dolby Vision. And anytime that you have to run on a tonal mapping technology like that right now, is not being supported from Adobe at the moment. So even though you may have a display that's capable of HDR, well, you need the software to support that display first before you can really view your content in HDR. Whether the OS wants to communicate with the display and support it or not, it doesn't matter quite as much as this piece of software that I'm running right now, which is Camera Raw 15, supporting this. Now, at the end of all this, what I can simply do is just simply save this out by going to hovering over that thumbnail and just really clicking on that little down icon or download icon there. And you can save this in a variety of formats. So I'm going to say save as JPEG. I'm going to leave the name the same right now. And the format that we're using at the moment in time is JPEG XL. So I have a quality set to 70 to 99. And I say enable HDR display. Now, when you enable HDR display, you can tag this with the color space. So you can tag this with HDR sRGB or Rec 709, HDR P3, or HDR Rec 2020. I would say HDR P3 is probably the best format to use for this at the moment. This way you get the color fidelity and a color gamut that most display can show right now. Some have also asked me, do I think a new color gamut will come out because of these HDR previews? I would say no, because if you really think about P3, it's a large color gamut. What it's really doing right now is just mapping a lot of the tones inside that gamut, so you have that true white and everything. And I think the current color spec at this point in time can still contain all these extra range or dynamic range in HDR. It's just that what we're getting is more dynamic range, not necessarily more colors than what the current display can show per se. So that's just my thought on that one. So once I'm done with this, I'll click on save. And if I go to my folder where I have this saved, you will see that it saves it as a JXL. The problem with this right now is that there are very few apps that understands it. And if that app can open this JPEG XL or JXL file at the moment, it doesn't really know how to preview an HDR just yet. Like I said, we are in the early infancy of this whole thing, but it's just absolutely cool to be able to view our pictures this way. What I'm going to do now is cancel out from Camera Raw. And let's see if we can open this JPEG XL up in Photoshop in a moment. So the moment I try to open this up in Photoshop, it says you could not complete your request because Photoshop does not recognize the type of file. This is how early we are in this technology that, I mean, Photoshop has fully yet to support it. But technically, because of Camera Raw plugin, Photoshop should be able to now display in HDR as well, although I haven't been able to get that to work just yet. So anyway, this is a top level overview of Camera Raw 15 HDR preview, and hopefully I have convinced you why I think this is super exciting and is really changing the way how we are going to edit our digital files going forward for the next decade. And this, I think, is one of the most profound changes in photography. In fact, in digital post-production, I don't think I have ever been this excited, since like RAW and Camera Raw, for example, process version number 2 or number 3 in Lightroom version 4, for instance. Adobe have done a lot of great job with masking in this latest Camera Raw version, and they've done a great job in Lightroom, but I think this is the feature that really carries everything over the top. And I can't wait to see all my pictures edited that way, and for the technology to be fully supported, not just only on these displays, but other displays, and also most importantly, the display that I always have with me, which is the one on my phone, which can already support HDR content, but not yet for photo, right? This is coming. A few more things to note about this as well is that we are now in the early stages of a format war again. So Adobe is looking at JPEG XL for HDR JPEG export. Apple is looking at HEIF in HDR. So we're going to see which one of these really prevail, or if this is going to be a dual format that takes us forward into the next decade with HDR. But like I said, everything is just at the beginning, and this is an exciting time to be alive as a photographer. Anyway, I hope that you find this information helpful. If you have anything you want me to test or want to know more about this, any questions or comments, leave them below. Give this a like, hit the bell to be notified if you're new, and in art we trust.